Good afternoon, everyone. Gonna give this a couple seconds so people can filter on in. Might be some people in the waiting room. Oh, everyone's coming in now. Good afternoon, Dennis, Karen, Robert, Tracy, Brad. All these guys are coming in. Thank you guys so much for being here live for our webinar. Appreciate you coming in and learning more about the DOT series. This is our first time ever doing a series like this, so we're really grateful for the people who have expressed a lot of interest in this. It's really been fun to see some of the questions that have come out of this as well. So thanks for being a part of our very educational experiment here, and we're really, really grateful that Ken is sharing his knowledge with us as well. So without further ado, I'll get into some housekeeping for you guys. So thank you for joining live. If for any reason, you got to hop off, you've got a meeting, you have something else on your plate, this is recorded. So you'll be able to access this at any time after everything's recorded. We upload all of our webinars to YouTube, so you're able to view them at any time. You're also going to get a copy of the presentation slides and some bonus material, which I will let Ken explain, as well as coming your way through that email as well. So if you do have any questions during the webinar, you are welcome to type them in to the question part of the Zoom attendee or the chat. Ken is able to see both, and I can see both as well. So we will happily answer your questions either during the presentation if it makes sense to, or we'll save them all for the end as well. So just in case you're joining us for the first time, I'm going to introduce Ken, and I'm going to give it my lightning round treat. So he is a risk control consultant here at Hausman Group. He has been a lovely addition and is full of knowledge. He is very, very well versed in the DOT, so we are excited for him to share even more of that with you guys today. So without further ado, I will toss it on over to Ken. Thanks, Ken.
All right, thank you, Cassie, and welcome back to those of you that were here for the 101 series. Today's topic, we're going to spend most of it just talking about screening your drivers. We'll get into the part 391 of the rules for driver files, and we'll talk about some of the changes and things that employers need to be aware of for that. But for the most part today, we're going to talk about a few different things. First off, why is this a priority? A lot of people think MVRs are just reviewed by your carrier. We don't need to do any more than that. FMCSA regulations and some other insurance things definitely play into that. That there's some need for employers to do more. We'll recap just a real quick tidbit of the 101 series about the difference between commercial motor vehicle and CDL vehicles, and then the intro, because there are some differences here with driver files between those of you that are traveling out of state and not. When do we need those driver files? What elements do you need to have in there? The 2022 changes that took place for that. The MVR checks. How do we get them? Where do we get them? What kind of information should we look for? What should we have in place outside of that? And we'll talk just a little bit of some stuff that's outside of that, but the pre-employment screening program is something that the FMCSA offered a few years ago. They don't have a ton of companies that take advantage of that, but it's basically an MVR on steroids, kind of. We'll talk about that a little bit more. And then there's the Drug and Alcohol Clearinghouse. That's the kind of the third element to this whole driver screening thing. It's technically not part of the driver file, but it is, because you are required, if you have CDL drivers, to check that information. So why is this driver screening so critical? This is the why part of this whole presentation today. First off, it is a Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration recommendation or requirement, not a recommendation, it's a requirement that you have driver files and that you make sure your drivers meet certain medical clearances as well as their MVR criteria as part of that whole process. I'm not a big fan always of just using the because the government said so excuse or reasoning. So I'm going to go into a little further, but I guess part of this, it comes back to your insurance premiums. If we have a bunch of drivers on our drivers list that are questionable driving records, some accidents, some claims that go along with that, that makes your premiums go up. And if we can make sure that our drivers are good drivers before they get sent into your insurance carrier, that goes a long way into reducing insurance premiums. Does that mean there's a discount if you do these things? No. Terms, no. But it will certainly weigh into that factor, right? So the insurance company already kind of expects you to do that. So if they're not doing that, there's going to be some negatives that go along with that. I can't tell you how many times in my years when I was on the carrier side yet that I would have an underwriter, when they're coming up with your renewal pricing, come to me and ask, Ken, what is this company doing for your driving screening or driver screening? They ask us to put 2 people on the driver's list that might have had DWIs, or they didn't have a suspended license yet or something. It makes the company look very poorly in the underwriter's eyes. And that's not something you want to have happen with your underwriter at renewal time. A big chunk of this, though, has to do with your driver's performance, and hopefully this is how it does change your premiums. Past actions are usually a pretty good indicator of future performance. You have a driver that's had a whole bunch of speeding tickets in the past 10 years or 3 years, chances are pretty good they're going to have some stuff like that with you as well. And if we can do those things and screen those drivers out, it helps. And the opposite of that is true as well. If you have an accident with a driver that had a whole bunch of bad speeding tickets or maybe some other things on their driving record that were very poor, that changes the court's outlook on punitive damages and things. So again, if we're not screening those drivers out and preventing them from driving for you, it can cost you a lot in the ultimate lawsuits that come from accidents. So just as a recap, we talked about this in the 101 session, but you'll hear me use the words intra or inter or interstate or intrastate today, basically just meaning that you're crossing the state line or not. So again, we focus on Wisconsin rules when we talk about intrastate, because that's where the majority of our clients that are on this call are based out of. But if you do cross the state lines, you become applicable to all of the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration regulations, and that would be an interstate. And it can include some stuff like shipping product around the country, but we're not going to get into that a whole lot today because we talked about that in our 101. But depending on the manifested loads that you're carrying, you might have picked it up in Wisconsin and delivered it in Wisconsin, but it was started in Florida. And that's an interstate cargo that changes it as well. 2 big vehicle weights. Again, a CDL weight is over 26,000 pounds. CMV or commercial motor vehicle weight is over 10,000 pounds. So you'll hear me again talk about those 2 weights today as we talk about driver files and when some of these things are required. There's also some passenger requirements. Again, we'll focus on the weights here today. We spent more time on this in the 101 session, so I won't go into all those other regulations. Our first topic, driver files. When I get asked to do mock DOT inspections or audits of companies, one of the biggest things we look at is your driver files. Do you have the information in there that you need? Is it current? Is it accurate? Does it look like anybody did anything with this information? It applies to all commercial motor vehicles if you're crossing the state lines, but it applies to CDL vehicles if you're staying in the state of Wisconsin. State Patrol has actually given me their presentation in the last year, and it also talked about the fact that they do not require driver files for commercial motor vehicles unless you're crossing the state lines. So that is one of the bigger changes that I actually push, because I still think the elements of Pre-91 are good for companies to use, whether you're crossing the state lines or not. But in theory, and I think there's also some things in there that your insurance carrier is going to ask you to do. So some of this information maybe you don't need if you're staying in the state of Wisconsin with a non-CDL vehicle. But if you're crossing the state lines, all of this would apply to you. When we talk about retaining records, everything that's in a driver file needs to be kept for the length of the employment of that driver plus 3 years. So after 3 years that this person has left, you can purge your records for that particular driver file. There are a few things within the driver file that you can purge after 3 years, and you don't have to take great notes on this because, as Cassie mentioned, we're going to send you a packet of information that has all these dates in it, the information in there, the link to the FMCSA regulations, as well as sample forms if you don't have some of the elements of this in there. So there are some things that you can purge after 3 years, though. You don't need to have 20 years of MVRs in there if you have current ones in there. So again, there are some things that you can purge out of there. The pamphlet that we're going to send you talks about that in more detail, so I won't spend a ton of time on that. For Wisconsin, and I will be honest, I have read this in the past and I missed the way this was worded. Driver files are part of 391. So it's Part 391 of the federal regulations, and the state of Wisconsin through Trans 327 says that we adopt all of Part 391 with 3 exceptions, and it has to do with some of these CDL requirements. So you can have a driver that's has diabetes controlled by insulin in Wisconsin. There are some vision standards, and there are some other waivers that go along with some of the at-fault accidents and things that. So again, actually, you can't have a vision issue if you had something that popped up as an accident or a violation. That's one of the kind of weird things that the state of Wisconsin allows. But it didn't say anything in those exceptions about driver files until you read way down at the bottom of this. And then it goes back and it says that parts 32703, which adopts all of the federal regulations, says that it doesn't apply to anybody that's not in a CDL vehicle, essentially. So I'm paraphrasing there, but essentially a driver file is not required because of 327.09 of the state regulation. So again, we do not need driver files in that situation. What pieces of a driver file do we need? Well, there's a few different pieces of this, and I have listed everything here that's listed underneath Part 391 if you read the actual federal regulations. One of the initial ones is a driver's application for employment, and that is not necessarily your typical HR application for employment. It is a driver-specific application for employment. And that is in the sample packet that we're going to send out. It has some questions about some drug and alcohol things that are actually obsolete now. But it does talk about safety performance issues and accidents and things specific to driving that may not be in your typical HR application. Doesn't mean you can't use it for your normal application and just cross it off if it's not a commercial motor vehicle driver. But again, if you have a CDL driver in the state of Wisconsin or somebody that crosses the state lines in a vehicle over 10,000 pounds, you're supposed to have an actual driver's application. Copy of the MVR at time of hire. And there's 2 different MVRs here. For the most part, we're talking about the same thing. You need a copy of this at MVR at time of hire, which goes back 3 years. You need an annual MVR, which is down a couple below that. That goes back 1 year. But most MVRs are going to cover that anyway. So again, if you're pulling an MVR in the state of Wisconsin, it's going to have a 3-year history listed there. It may even go back 5 years for some major violations. You need to have a copy of that in the file. That is a written abstract, has to be in the file, and not a thumbs up or thumbs down from your insurance carrier. The other thing that's required here, certificate of road test or equivalent. We'll chat about that just a little bit more, but if you have somebody with a CDL driver has taken their road test in a CDL vehicle. So if you're hiring somebody with a Class A CDL, they took their road test in a Class A CDL required vehicle. That is an equivalent if you have proof of their CDL. If you're hiring somebody to drive a commercial motor vehicle, they don't need a CDL. You are hiring somebody that maybe took their driving test when they were 16 years old in a 1980 Chevy Celebrity, because that's what I used. And that was not certainly the vehicle that you're going to ask me to hook up a tandem axle trailer and pull a skid steer around with if you're a construction company. There's a difference in those 2 vehicles. And you are required at that point to do a road test to make sure that they understand some of the elements of driving a vehicle that's a lot bigger than the one that they took their driving test in. You need to have a note that says that you reviewed the annual MVR. So again, that's great that you actually got a copy of that in the file from the whatever website you use to get MVRs from. But somebody needs to actually look at that and determine if there's anything on there that prevents them from driving for you. Not rocket science to do that, but it needs to be listed as to the fact that you did check those. You need to have a copy of the medical examiner certificate, or there is a CDLIS MVR that's specific to CDL programs. It goes into more details. For the most part, companies that I deal with, they just get a copy of the medical certificate, the med card, if you will, from them. And then you need to make sure that that medical examiner was actually listed on the medical registry or the national registry, which is something that came about over 10 years ago already. And then if you have somebody that has some type of variances, that there's some type of special evaluation, it really gets into some kind of strange loss of a limb. There's some other clearances that they can actually give them a skills test to determine that they're a potential handicap maybe allows them to still drive. You need to have those letters and stuff in that file as well. So the second to last one, not real common. There are a couple other items in the packet of information that we're going to send you that were not listed in that last page. So the first one is that it talks about an annual driver's certification of violations. Some of you that have been doing this for a bunch of years recall the days of asking your drivers to give you an annual form that says this is all the violations that I've had. That went away back in 2022. Not a bad idea to do it yet, but it's kind of a duplication of already getting a copy of the MVR from all your drivers to go ahead and ask them, what did you have on your MVR? Because we're going to get the information anyways. So that's one of the things that kind of went away. The other three things down there, it talks about some pre-employment drug and alcohol documents. We'll talk about the the drug and alcohol clearinghouse towards the end of this presentation today, but that is not specifically mentioned in a driver file. However, you are required to verify that you have somebody that has a negative drug test and that they're listed or not listed in the PSP. They're not listed in the drug and alcohol clearinghouse, so that you need to verify the information that's there. So the other two things here, there's some stuff about longer combination vehicle records. If you have somebody that's pulling doubles and triples, which I don't think too many of us do here, there's some separate forms that go along with that. And then proof that if you have any entry-level driver training certificates. So again, this is a newer topic. If you're sending them to certain schools to get their CDLs nowadays, it has to be a specific school. They have to verify that there's completion. So there's some specific information that goes along with that. Not the focus of my presentation today. So I mentioned the driver's application. We'll just kind of take a couple of these pieces and then we'll get into some of the other specifics. The driver's application is specific application to drivers. And I mentioned there's a few different things on there. There's also a couple things that if you have a non-CDL commercial motor vehicle driver, they have to list all of their employers that they have worked for in the last 3 years. So a cumulative record over the last 3 years, they need to at least list the last 3 years of employment. If you do this and you find that there was big gaps in there, again, it's something that an employer should be looking at to see, well, why did they not have somebody there for 3 months and 2 years ago? Could have been COVID related, who knows? But is there some other reasons that go along with that? So again, take a look at those gaps in employment history. If you have a CDL driver, they also has to list every company that they operated for the last 10 years. Doesn't mean that you have to go back and check with every company that was there for the last 10 years, but the CDL driver is required to list those companies for the last 10 years that they were involved with. It also talks about the inquiry to previous employers. This did not go away, which is one of the things that's a little, some misconceptions out there, I guess. When the Drug and Alcohol Clearinghouse took effect 3 years ago, back in 2020, the plan was in this year in 2023 that employers would no longer have to go back and ask previous employers for drug and alcohol related information. Some companies took that to mean that I didn't have to ask them any information at all, and that's not true. The clearinghouse took the place of you having to ask them about any drug and alcohol violations that they may have had or any return to duty testing, because now that this has been in place for 3 years, the clearinghouse is supposed to give you that information without having to ask anybody. Because those of you that have been doing this, I'm probably worked with more than one company that did not provide any of this information because they thought it was a violation of HIPAA regulations, even though FMCSA specifically required them to provide this information to you. But you must document that you made an attempt to provide this information for the last 3 years. You go back and ask them any company they drove for over the last or operated for the last 3 years, was any accidents or safety information. Again, sample information's in the packet that we're sending you. We don't need to go through this in detail. There's actually a sample questionnaire there. So you're going to ask for that information that's listed down below. Basically accidents, in general, driver ID. Did they work for you? Did they drive for you? Do they have any accidents for you? And an accident is basically what triggers a drug test if it was a CDL driver. It's a fatality, injury that required treatment, or damage requiring a tow. If there wasn't anything like that, we don't need to worry about if they backed into something. It's specific FMCSA or CDL or DOT accidents, if you will. And you have to maintain that for the length of employment plus 3 years, just like everything else in the driver file. If there was something in that information from the previous employer that the prospective driver didn't agree with, and I have run into these a few times where a driver might have been cited for an accident that they didn't think was their fault. The brakes went out, and maybe in their opinion, they've asked you to fix the brakes and you didn't fix them, and they drove it anyways and got into an accident, whatever the issue might be. The driver has a right to ask you as the prospective employer, I need to see a copy of that. And they have to do that in writing within 30 days of either being hired by you or being notified of a denial of employment. And then they can go back and ask their employer within 5 days of the written request. I'm sorry, you have 5 days to provide that information to them. And then they can submit a rebuttal to their previous employer and say, I would like you to put this in my file so that if you send this information out to any other prospective employers, that we have a copy of this. Doesn't happen very often, just throwing it out there, because if they do ask, just back of your head, remember that I have to do something with that. A road test. This is another one that I see missed a few times when I go through this. I've already talked about the difference between a CDL and a non-CDL driver here. But a CDL, if we have a proof that they have a CDL for the type of vehicle that you're going to be driving, or they will be driving, so a representative vehicle, they passed the road test already because the state agency that approved their CDL gave them a road test in a representative vehicle. If you're hiring that commercial motor vehicle, though, I'll say not only is it not a bad idea for all CDL drivers, but it's a good required for the CMV, because again, this is somebody that took a road test in a car, and now you're going to ask them to drive a 1 ton with a 10,000 pound trailer. Maybe not quite CDL required, but still a lot different asking vehicle than the small car that I took my test in when I was 16. You should still be doing a road test with them. And the road test has to be done by somebody within the company of sufficient duration. Again, this is all in the packet as well, but we'll talk just a couple pieces here. Do they know how to do a pre-inspection, the pre-trip inspection of the vehicle? Again, walk them around. Do they understand what they're looking at? Do they know how to put a trailer on and couple it properly and take it off properly? Is there certain things they need to do to make sure the vehicle is safe to move down the road? Anything about emergency controls and equipment? Can they drive? Can they pass? Can they, function this vehicle? Are they tailgating? Are they driving essentially safely? Can they turn the vehicle properly? Those of you that have watched somebody new with a trailer hop a curb, you understand what we're talking about here. Do we know how to take a wide turn? Can we do a roundabout? Are there things that they're going to be asked to do that you want to make sure they can do, because we don't know this without going through this test, right? Braking, and then backing and parking. And again, backing of a trailer is certainly one of those things that we should be looking at, or backing of a large vehicle. And again, should be certified by the employer that you did this. Sample forms in there again for your certification. It's not a huge piece of information, but again, if somebody took their CDL test 10 years ago for another company, and you're going to ask them to drive a different type of vehicle, maybe it was a van versus a flatbed, there are some differences. I do think it's a good idea, even for your CDL drivers, to go through this. However, it is not a requirement. Driving records. Again, this is one of those that over the years, I've had a bunch of companies ask if we will screen drivers for them. And some companies will still give you a thumbs up or a thumbs down if you have a driver that has a questionable record. You might get a note from the insurance company that says, well, we'll add them, but you should really consider putting them on a watch list or something. It's not the time that you want to be asking your insurance carrier to do this. Let's send in good ones. And if you screen them first, get a copy of their driving record, and we'll give you a couple sources where you can get them from. It's a good idea. And a copy is required in the file for your driver file. So again, if you needed a driver file, you need a copy of their driving record in that file. I'm going to go a step further though, because we talked about the CMV in Wisconsin not needing it. Your insurance carrier is going to want to see this for all drivers. So even the people that are in company pickup trucks and small vehicles, they're going to want to see that information for any vehicle or any driver that you have. And it also includes, if it have to, your spouse or family members, if they're allowed to drive these company vehicles. Okay. There's several companies out there that I've worked with over the years that do allow spouses to drive their company vehicles. A company I came from prior to Houseman did. We actually had to send in my wife's driver's license just with mine every year as well, so they could check their driving records. If you're not going to do that, make sure you have something in writing in your fleet safety program that talks about who is allowed to drive these company vehicles. Probably not talking about semis here as much as the company pickups and some of the larger vehicles. Is it acceptable for an emergency? There may be some options that you have there, but again, spell it out. And if it's going to be anything more than like allowing them to back it out into the street because they need to move the vehicle, you should be checking those driving records as well. Also include in there your hired and non-owned drivers. That's a fancy way of saying that your could be your owner operators, but it really means more your people that are driving their personal vehicles on company business. So for our contractors that are on the call, if you have foreman or anybody that drives regularly to and from job sites throughout the course of the day in their personal vehicles, especially if they're allowed to reimburse the mileage is a good indicator. But if it's anything more than incidental use of their personal vehicles, you should really be checking their driving records to make sure they're safe to drive as well. So again, what's good for your CDL drivers kind of goes all the way down and is a good idea for all of your drivers. So in addition, I guess there's a couple other things here. In addition to just getting a copy of that driving abstract, I'm going to suggest that you also have a written fleet safety program that again spells out when personal use is allowed, if you're allowed to use it with family members or anybody else that's allowed to drive for you. Part of that is also an authorization to check driving records. So they sign off a form that says that you recognize that you're going to be checking my driving records for employment purposes, and there's some other language. Again, it's in that sample packet. Keep a copy of that in that driver abstract or in the driver file rather. It's good information to have. I don't believe you're ever going to get asked for that. However, it is something that is kind of listed in that federal regulations that it is required of you to ask for that. And it is a good idea. The PARS program that we'll talk about, I don't believe asks you to actually send that in to them yet, but it is good information that you should have in place. And then again, some type of proof that you reviewed it annually, whether that's proof that they passed, that they're still acceptable, discussed citations, however it is that you word that it's still an acceptable driver. We need proof that you actually looked at the MVR and provided that information to in the driver file. So, and then again, a couple things that are not MVRs. I already talked about the last one about letting your insurance company screen your drivers. It's not a good idea. They won't share that MVR with you. At least they shouldn't be, because that's a violation of the Fair Credit Reporting Act to share driving record information. So what you're going to get is a thumbs up or thumbs down, or what maybe a little explanation why they weren't acceptable. But that is not a driving record. FMCSA regulations require you to have a copy of their driving record listed. CCAP is another one. I have had companies over the years ask for CCAP or tell me they search these things in CCAP. CCAP is the court access system here in the state of Wisconsin. Not all counties even submit to CCAP. So you can do a CCAP search and see if they had any court proceedings that went along with the driving violation or moving violation. It's not universal. There are lots of counties here in the state of Wisconsin that do not provide information to CCAP, and it is not comprehensive information. So you need to make sure you're getting an MVR from an actual good MVR source, such as PARS. PARS is the DMV portal, if you will. It's the Public Abstract Request System. If you just Google WI PARS, you will get to this website right here. It does require that you as an employer submit a background check for anybody that's going to be using this. And once you're approved, then you can go online. You can get instantaneous driving records for all your drivers listed. It's great information. It's about as cheap as you can get as well. And it does also allow you to get into the employer notification program, which we'll talk about in a second. But there are some negatives to it. And it only covers Wisconsin driver's licenses. So if you have some employees that maybe moved in from out of state and haven't switched their license over yet, first off, state law says they're supposed to, so they should be switching it to Wisconsin. But if you have somebody that lives in Arizona for the winters and comes up here in the summer, potentially there's some people that may not be able to. Users do have to complete the background check. It's about $5.50 per search when you go on there. I thought there was actually a charge for MVRs that was $12, but I was not finding that information today when I was looking at this website. So they changed the website just a little bit from when I used to use this myself, but that is not a major expense. Even with 100 drivers, it's not going to cost you much over $100 or a few $100. But it does allow you to also get into the employer notification program, and that is a key benefit. If you are relying on the insurance carrier to pull your MVRs at renewal time, there's a couple negatives with that. One is, again, they're doing this at time renewal pricing on your auto premium. So it's not a good time for your underwriter to tell you that you have a bunch of violations to your drivers, or worse, you have 3 of them with suspended licenses that have been driving for you for the last 8 months on suspended licenses. It doesn't end well. Recognize that firsthand from several of my companies over the years. The other problem is most insurance carriers do not check all of the driving records every year. So they batch sample or do some batch samples of their MVR lists. They may still miss these things. If you're in the employer notification program, the state sends you an email saying something posted to this person's driving record, you should pull it. You pull the MVR, there's a small fee to that, but you can do something about it immediately. And it might have been that their FedMed card expired. It might have been that they got a minor violation for something out on the street in their personal car. Could have been that they got a DWI and lost their license. You don't know until you check it. But the nice part is you can check it immediately as opposed to waiting till the end of the year. And when the underwriter now is doing your renewal pricing, you've taken off some of these drivers that have had too many things and are no longer eligible to drive for you. And it looks perfectly clean. So again, you're not paying for everybody, because if you're in this program, the driver file does not require you to annually get a copy of every driving record. You're doing the new hires, which you would have in your record, and then you would have anybody that you got notified of throughout the course of the year because of the employer notification program. So if you have 100 drivers, you may have 3 or 4 new hires and 4 or 5 that got a violation. You're only paying for about 10 of these a year. So you're not talking about a major expense. And the big benefit here is, again, that you are able to do something about it way before the underwriters know about these things. If you have multiple state drivers, so you have some drivers that live over the border in the state of Illinois. Illinois does not offer employer notification. There's only 19 out of the 50 states that offer some type of employer notification program. So and again, we're surrounded by a couple of them. So if you have drivers, and again, I'll just use Illinois, that are allowed to drive for you all year because you don't have employer notification, but a driver in the state of Wisconsin gets notified that they had a DWI and lost their license, and you took them off the vehicle, but the guy in Illinois is still driving because we didn't know about it for 6 months until we did an annual. It's not fair. So again, I'm a big fan, and I think of those of you that are HR focused and on the call, understand the importance of keeping your hiring and firing procedures uniform. If you can't get in the employer notification for all of your drivers, there are things that you can do, but I wouldn't suggest using it for Wisconsin drivers if you can't use it for all of them, unless you have employer notification in the states that they happen to be listed in. If you have those out-of-state drivers, though, one of the things that you can do is, if you're not in the employer notification for everybody, you can ask drivers to provide you with an immediate notification. So in your fleet safety program that they sign that they're going to participate in and agree to abide by, they have to notify you of any tickets. Been on companies that did that. That's not uncommon. And again, at that point now, I can go pull their driving record, and you're going to need to pull an annual on everybody because it's not in the employer notification again. So it is more expensive for the employer in that situation, but that immediate notification to the employer can help combat the fact that we don't get immediate notification from the state. You can go either to the individual states and check driving records. Most states offer you some type of version of PARS, even if they don't have that in there. or there are some multiple state MVR programs. If your insurance carrier has an agreement with that, there's usually some discounted pricing that they might have. Most of them have some type of program, mvrs.com. There's a few other companies out there that offer this type of stuff. I don't have any perfect recommendations for which ones to use. They're all similar. Check the costs, which one you want to use on them. You can Google them and find most of that information out there, but your insurance carrier may have a discount for you. It's worth checking on. And I see there are a few questions on this. I am going to wait until the end of this and we'll come back and answer those questions as we get into the end of this presentation here. But I want to keep going, make sure I get through the rest of this. One of the other programs that I mentioned in the beginning is the Pre-Employment Screening Program, PSP. PSP was created about 10 or 15 years ago already. It's been a few years. It's essentially a voluntary screening that goes beyond the MVR. For those of you that have checked your safety management scores for your DOT number, you see some of the violations that are listed there that don't show up on an MVR. Load securement, logbook violations, certain vehicle violations, they may not show up on an MVR when you pull the driving records. The PSP program is a national program that checks how somebody listed with a DOT number, essentially, or associated with a DOT number, if they ever got stopped with one of those vehicles, it'll give you their roadside inspection data for all of your drivers listed there. So again, it goes back, it'll cover CDL and CMV drivers, so it's not a CDL specific program. It requires a specific disclosure form signed. So I talked about the MVR disclosure form that we agree you're going to check them. PSP has a second one that you need to use, and it's actually there's penalties if they do audit your company that they can assess. So you want to make sure you're doing the actual audit form for the PSP. Their data says that there's 7% lower crash rates, 17% lower out of service rates for companies that use the PSP. That's one of those chicken or egg things with me. Is that because better companies use PSP, or is that because PSP makes you a better company? Can't answer that question for you. It does give you some more information if you're looking for the data as to what else is out there. Basically, it provides 5 years with the crash and 3 years with the roadside inspection data versus just your typical MVR data that the state's going to give you. It'll list all their CDL numbers that they might have had if they ever lost their license and got a new CDL because of a different state or something. It'll list those CDL numbers for you so you can see those things that may not be listed in driving record. Includes the MVR information. There's a bunch of other data there, but basically it gives you a federally managed one-stop shop for roadside inspection data, if you will. Not MVR data, it's in addition to that, but it's gives you more information to want to consider. The one thing I will say is it's not as easy to screen. I can tell you what a good driving record is, and most carriers are going to use something similar to the 3 minors in a 3-year period and no majors as a eligible criteria. PSP data doesn't really have that. So you look at a driver and they had 2 load securement violations and a logbook violation and a few other things that fire extinguisher violations. How many of those is too much? That data is not really out there. So again, it's not bad data, just it's not as easy to quantify. I have a lot of trucking companies that still don't use this. It's a pretty small list of companies right now that are using this. There's a cost, not a huge cost. It costs you $10 for every record, plus a little bit of an annual fee, depending on how many vehicles you have listed with the FMCSA power units. So the drug and alcohol information. So one of the things that wasn't really listed on the driver file was drug and alcohol information. This is something specific only to CDLs. I suggest that you still do this and keep a copy of these things in your CDL or in the driver file for a one-stop shop here. But if you have CDL drivers, before they can drive for you, you have to have proof of a negative controlled substance test before you allow them to perform any safety sensitive function for your company. So that's actually a drug test needs to be in hand and you verify that it's negative. You must also check the drug and alcohol clearinghouse for all new hires before you can allow them to drive. So those are 2 different things, but the drug and alcohol clearinghouse is one of the newer features that came about back in 2020. And essentially what happened was prior to 2020, a company could have omitted a company. So I might have worked for Houseman Trucking and failed the drug test, and I decided to quit, and I got a job with the trucking company across the street. And I didn't tell them that I worked for Houseman for the last 3 months because I don't want them to find out about it. And the Drug and Alcohol Clearinghouse now became a one-stop shop where every drug test that you fail or pass has to be listed here, and you have to have access to that information. So before you hire somebody, you have to go into the Drug and Alcohol Clearinghouse and check their driving or their history, if you will. Prior to 2023, you actually still had to go back and ask employers if there was any negative drug testing that was associated with them. As of January 6th of this year, you no longer have to go out and ask the prospective employers or the previous employers if they had any drug and alcohol violations, because you get it all from the Drug and Alcohol Clearinghouse. To do that, you have to register with the clearinghouse. You have to purchase what they call queries. So you're buying buckets of searches, if you will. And an employer, before you allow them to drive, you have to do a full query for all pre-employment checks. And annually, you have to do at least a limited query. So a full query gives you data going back a bunch of years and specific information about what drug and alcohol violations and any return to duty testing. The limited query, in theory, once they've been driving for you, really only adds any new data that you added to it as a carrier. So you shouldn't need to do that, but it's kind of a check to make sure that they didn't have something that popped up because they moonlighted on a second job or something. So it gives you the access to the information that happened in the last year. That can be a limited query, which is cheaper, obviously. There's also some requirements for employers to submit data to the query. So or to the clearinghouse, I'm sorry. The positive drug test or alcohol test is one of those things that you may or may not have to do. If you're in a consortium or you're in, say, with a Concentra, and Concentra says we will submit our data to the clearinghouse. As long as there's an agreement and you can verify that was done, you don't necessarily specifically have to do that. However, there are some other things that they don't know about unless you as the employer submit it. And alcohol use within 4 hours performing, if you notice they were drinking and didn't take a drug test, but you physically saw them drinking in 4 hours before they came on duty, needs to be reported. If they consumed alcohol within 8 hours of an accident and didn't get drug tested first, that's again a violation that needs to be reported. Positive drug test for specific drugs, again, maybe some requirements there, but again, if you have an agreement with your drug testing company to do that and submit that data for you, as long as you're confident that it's being submitted, you don't have to duplicate your efforts. But there are some other things like refusal to submit. If you got a random drug test for your driver, Ken Alderton, and I decided I didn't want to go in today because I didn't want to fail my drug test, I refused to take it. You as the employer would have to submit that data that says that I refused it and I would lose my eligibility to drive. So again, that's something that Concentra would have no idea about because they didn't refuse it there. They refused it with my employer. So that was kind of the gist of our presentation. And I see I did have a whole bunch of questions that popped up here today. So I'll start at the beginning here and just try to go through these. Relating to MVRs, are you required to hold the initial MVR or the most recent? Again, if you have one that is 3 years old, you don't have to keep the initial one past the 3-year date. So again, I like keeping the 3 years in there. Do I think the State Patrol would get on your case if you threw it out and you had a copy of a new one that was 3 years old? Don't really think so. But again, this regulation says you're supposed to keep the initial one for 3 years, and then you can purge that one out of there. If you're in the employer notification program, you keep the initial one for at least the 3 years, and then you can purge it. And if you don't ever have a new one because they didn't have anything pop up in the employer notification program, there really isn't a new one. Okay. How do you document a certificate of road test? If they are grandfathered into this, they would have been taken off a written test at that time. So if you have a CDL driver, that particular one, again, they have a CDL license, you have a copy of their record, that's all you need. if you have a new driver that's coming on board for you, you should give them a road test yourself, right? The employer gives the road test. It's not a federal agency. We're not talking about a new entrant CDL or a new CDL. We're talking about you have a new hire that's coming to work for you. They didn't need a CDL because they were, again, not driving a CDL vehicle, but you're going to ask them to drive a 1-ton with a 10,000-pound trailer. They should get a road test in that vehicle. You stick somebody else in the seat with them. You have them drive around the block or do the couple hours worth of work for you long enough to make it worthwhile doing. Check, see if they come back, and you document that they did that. Again, there's a sample form in there. There's some information that you can look for. The information is pretty standard. So, is there verbiage on the employer notification program, including FMCSA, a state annual MVR? So, I think the short answer to that is no. The EMP does not say that it's a specifically eliminates the need to do that. However, the State Patrol will definitely tell you that if you're in that program, it gives you the ability to use that data if they ever did an MVR or driver file evaluation or audit of you. If you read deep into the regulations, it does talk about MVRs and doing an annual if it's an employer notification program, and the FMCSA actually has a list of states that have the employer notification. So it is out there. It is not easy to find, but that data is listed. You could, if you wanted proof, you could ask State Patrol. And again, I can tell you the answer that I think it is, but I'm not the one that issues a violation or a citation to a company. So I would say if you really want to know that for sure, you can send an email off to the State Patrol and ask that question specifically, and they'll give you an answer in writing, or they'll at least call you and tell you what their version of that is. But I have had both State Patrol and FMCSA tell me that you don't need to do that. So is it legal to hold the pre-employment drug test in the driver file, or does not have to be specific or filed separately and in a different file cabinet? It is supposed to be separate. That said, I have had a lot of companies that will keep a record of that in there because it's all kind of one unique thing. Drug testing information is supposed to be separate from the employer driver or the driver file itself, though. So there is kind of a different criteria there. However, the packet we're going to send you talks about having some drug and alcohol documents. It basically is something that proved that you checked the PSP and that you have a version or copy of that in their file. And once those two check marks are on there, they're allowed to perform a safety sensitive function. So yes, you should have that in a separate file is the official answer to that. What required to ask the previous employer about if a driver, if we no longer required to ask anything. So the stuff you're required to ask previous employers about now is accidents and did they drive for you? That's in any major safety violations. So it's all about safety performance stuff now. Because again, driving or accidents don't specifically show up on the driving record check. So it gives you a chance to ask for that. So we can't have it in there for a one-stop shop. Again, I assume that question was the related to the drug and alcohol testing data. I don't think anybody's going to get on you for having it in one place shop. It is specifically mentioned that it's supposed to be in a separate file. The biggest chunk of this is that you're supposed to have the information and keeping in a separate file that you can reference. So usually drug and alcohol information is separate from that because of privacy issues and some other rules that I'd be honest, I don't quite completely understand enough to tell you how to answer that, but it is supposed to be in a separate file. I have never had anybody that did this. You could pull it out if they came in and you could have a separate file inside the driver file that has drug and alcohol information that if somebody came in, you could pull it out. Again, at least it's all in one location. As long as you're actually getting the PSP and the negative drug test, I really think there's a big issue with that. So I believe that was our last question if we answered them all. So unless anybody else has any questions, I'm going to let you go 10 minutes early today and I'll make it up on the 103 class. We'll go an hour and 10 minutes on the next one. So.
I hope we don't go an hour and 10 minutes on that one, but yeah, giving people some extra time back. Thank you all so much for showing up. Thank you so much for your questions. And if you think of anything after the presentation, in that email that will have the recording, the slides, and the driver qualification form. That is also going to be on there as Ken's contact information. So if you want to shoot him an email with anything you think of, no worries. Otherwise, we will see you guys in 2024 for DOT 103. Thanks so much and have a great rest of your afternoon.
Thanks, everybody.